This conference will now be recorded.
We are being
Is
recorded.
Jessica here?
Yes. Michael, do you have your video set that you can only see the person talking? Because there's, I only noticed partway through last meeting that there's some different options about who you see. You can either see everyone who's talking or active cameras. I actually found it was helpful for me to look at active cameras and then, monitor the chat box for people with their hands up. So
I'm not sure. I'm using an iPad, so all I see are see Paul, Monica, Ted, myself, Bernie, and Duncan.
Oh, I see. Michael, I think if you swipe either left or right, it'll show you the rest of the people.
I'm
Okay.
doing the same thing. I'm trying to work on my phone tonight so I can also see my screen, and I only see 6 people. So sorry if I don't see somebody, but I'm listening.
Right. Okay, well, we are recording and we are all here, so we have more than a quorum, which is great. So first thing on the agenda is any changes to the agenda. Does anyone have anything?
I have a very small one, which is that under other business, there's a zoning change from the city of Burlington that I sent out to you, just to make note of it, because the hearing is the same night as your next meeting. So I just want to make sure it was out in the public.
Great, thank you, Paul. Then we have open to the public for items not related to the agenda. Anyone have anything? I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. I don't see anyone with their video coming on. So we will move on to announcements. Does anybody have any announcements they'd like to share?
One item, Jessica.
Go ahead, Ted.
Well, a couple things. One, we're obviously delving into a lot of areas, and what sort of prompted I'm about to say is the situation with Mr. Abrams talking about his neighborhood. And I think Monica had brought this up some time ago with regard to somehow really trying to have neighborhoods understand the potential of a development or something, as opposed to being surprised. I'm not articulating what you had said, Monica, I think some time ago, but whenever there's sort of a change occurred, a lot of people aren't watching this. I mean, unless they have insomnia, but so they don't know what's going on. And then lo and behold, there's a development, or like where Mr. Abrams lives. So maybe if Paul or the city could think of ways, I guess Kevin Doran's thinking of some kind of news item online, but I don't know if published in the other paper, and something like any of the changes in zoning that we may be considering, infill, for instance. Mayfair Park folks probably have no idea, what we're talking about, and it has implications to them, and it might really surprise them at some point if suddenly there's a whole bunch of infill going on. So the point is, I think somehow we have to figure out how to make sure that the public is aware of that, so that they come to us, as Mr. Abrams has, sort of surprised. The other issue I had was with regard to Shelburne, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at their items, but it was interesting what they were talking about, and I sort of liked some of the wording. They're talking about infill, and one sentence that they included was undue adverse impact on the character of the neighborhood. And I remember, I think, Jessica, you were on the planning commission, and it was my first year. We were going through the comp plan, and I had suggested that, and it didn't go over very well. Folks had said, no, you can't do that. It's objective and subjective and so on. So anyway, but I think we have to really give some thought to, when we continue to delve into infill, what we're talking about with regard to various neighborhoods. That's it. Thanks.
Those are some great thoughts, Ted. Thank you. And anyone else have anything? Okay, Paul, do you have any other staff report for us?
No, I'll save it for the next regular meeting.
Okay, very good. So we can get into our work session on the land development regulation amendments. First, continuing our conversation regarding the forested habitat blocks and specifically their applicability. So, I know one thing that people had been requesting was some different kind of map items, which I know Paul does have prepared. They were also available as part of the interactive map viewer that I know, some of us at least had looked at ahead of time, but it might be helpful to look at some of that together.
Yeah, so sort of taking some of the feedback that we've gotten from you, I put together a few little slides here, and this is really for your work session, so I'm not intending to lead it too much, except to say that we've got lots of information available, and I thought I'd just very quickly run through these slides. We can zoom in and zoom out on anything in here to just sort of help you with your discussion. So just I'll take 2 minutes really quickly here. What you see on the screen right now has two colors, green and yellow. The yellow is the current Natural Resource Protection District and the park zones. The green are the forest blocks as presented by Arrowwood. This is a slightly more involved map that takes not only the NRP, but also pieces of land that are conserved privately, like Eastwood's natural area and some of the condo association land. This one here adds in a dark yellow all of the current regulated areas from Article 10 and 12. This is the same one, but takes off one layer that you've gotten some feedback on from a member of the public about one of the wetlands layers that might be a little bit not as good as the other ones. And I'll show you the difference of that in a second, the Vermont significant wetlands. This map here, this is sort of getting to the core of it. The green here, dark green and light green, are the areas that are forest blocks that are not otherwise regulated in the city. And then this is the same thing. You'll see there's little blue outlines. That's those Vermont significant wetlands that may or may not be very good. And I believe, and then these here are just a couple of parcels that are actually conserved in addition to what you see in the regulations. So I just wanted to give you that you're welcome to use any of these to talk about. I found this one to be both illuminating and also helpful to start this discussion in terms of what are the areas of the forest blocks that you might be regulating that you currently don't.
And just to be clear, Paul, those are the dark green ones. So everything else we got written into current regulations except for the dark green and the light
green and dark green. Yeah.
Yeah. The dark green and then the light green, I assume, is like a buffer.
It's the outer 100. It's the outer 300 feet.
Okay. Yep.
Because I know that you wanted to talk about those slightly separately. So, it's not a huge surprise if we zoom in here to the southeast quadrant that a lot of it is already covered, because when the city had put in the Natural Resource Protection District 15 years ago, it was based on the first Arrowwood study, and that included a lot of habitat areas. So
I'm sort of surprised at the west side of the Hill property. Yeah, I'm sort of surprised that sort of wasn't, because that sort of terminates the whole section from the south all the way north. And it's pretty significant forest, as I recall, but
Right, and the reason that that's not in there largely, Ted, is that is just outside of the southeast quadrant. So it wasn't part of that work 15 years ago. That's currently the industrial open space district. So that's the reason that's like that.
okay.
Paul, quick question on that. I'm sorry. Is that, I was just looking on the planned infrastructure map in the comp plan.
Yep.
Is the proposed extension of Swift Street, is it to go through that? Or is it going to go south of that?
If you were to advance it, this is Swift Street here. Sorry for using another green pen. And then the extension would go something like that.
Okay, so it would come that. All right.
Right. So, and if you want, you're happy. I didn't mention it in your staff notes, but you do have the results of the recent Tilly Drive study that talked about the pros and cons of that connection and whether you want to keep it on the map or not.
We have a just item in the chat box I just want to read. Carol and Alan Long pointed out that forest blocks aren't the same as Arrowwood's habitat blocks, which aren't all forested. And it is true, I know we've been trying to refer to them as habitat blocks.
Right.
But
Thank you. I typed too quickly. Those are forested habitat blocks, what are mapped there. They're the habit. These are the Arrowwood maps.
Yeah, and I often mistakenly use the word forest as well. So I have a question, Paul, about this map. Does it also include the connectors that we've been talking about?
It does not have them on there, but I can pull those in pretty quickly if you like.
I think that could be helpful because that is part of the discussion we've been having.
Right. Just give me a second here. I have to go into the.
Jessica, while Paul is working on pulling that up, because I agree that would be very helpful, there are also two other emails that the commission would have received, and I don't want to jump in, but I do think it's, I don't know when you want to introduce those, but I think both of them are helpful to the conversation. So before we dive into anything too deep, I just maybe Jessica, can you think about when you'd want to introduce those two emails from the public?
Yeah, I guess
Leslie and Alan are the two that I'm thinking of.
yeah. I was thinking, I guess if anyone had any comments or questions on the commission and wanted to see anything different right off, we could do that first and then talk about those emails we got. So I don't know if anyone has anything they want to see right away or questions or comments.
I mean, my only hope, my only comment would be that for tonight, it would be really nice to be able to get into some of the detail, particularly of the lighter green areas that are the transitional outside of the core. And there might be some specific areas of core too, but I'm really hoping that, I mean, I'm interested in hearing what people think about certain areas of the transitional habitat blocks, which we know is important, but I'd hope to hear what other people think about that specifically in certain areas. I can point to one now if you want, otherwise you can wait till we talk.
I'll just interject quickly to say that the connectors are now showing in the map. They're the sort of fluorescent green. For example, right here that I'm highlighting.
Where's that, Paul? I'm trying to figure it.
This is right here where I'm highlighting is the corner of Swift and Spear.
Okay.
And so this is the best connection, and it's not a great connection, but it's the best connection between the forested area by Meadowood and then sort of making its way where the artwork had been placed, I think a few years ago, by the cornfields of various cairns, and then over to the Edlin property.
I see.
Anything else? I mean, I think Monica did have a good idea about discussion that we could get into.
Jessica, can you clarify like where you would like the conversation to end tonight? Like, what are you hoping? What are you hoping we decide, or how far do we take this tonight?
Great question. I think at our last meeting we had some big questions about like how do we even define these, or are there areas where it doesn't make sense to regulate this type of resource. I know in the memo that Paul had, there's some specific items that show up on kind of the official map with our planned infrastructure. And I guess I'm not sure if we should, as a group, go through all those things. I think it makes sense to. I mean, they're kind of policy decisions, and maybe there's some of these areas that don't make sense. We also got public input, like you said, from 2 different emails, kind of addressing certain areas. I don't know if it's too much to do as a group, and we should kind of assign a smaller group of us to come back with some recommendations, or what. It's actually a little hard for me to know the best approach, but I think looking at this map, to me, there's a lot of overlap with our other protected areas, and it might make sense to really kind of zoom into each of these green areas and try to make a decision about them. It's a question for the group if we feel like we want to dive into that right now, or come up with kind of an approach to doing that.
Well, can I suggest an example area, and maybe we check that out and then just see what happens, and then from there we can tell if we're spiraling into chaos. But in the upper right, all I can see on my phone right now is Paul's map. Whoops, wait a minute, you moved it. Wait, can you go back to where you were, Paul? Yeah, okay. So in the upper right corner, and I'm not even paying attention to where on the map this is, I'm just looking at colors now only. On the upper right corner, we see that on the outside of the yellow, there's some of the dark green, and then below it is a lot of lighter green. That, to me, not knowing, like I said, I'm simply looking at the colors on this image. I'm seeing a lot of extraneous light green stretching off of the dark green that doesn't seem to be connecting to anything else. So that is an example of an area that I think that we should be looking at very closely to find out how important is that. I'll call them fingers, because that's kind of what people have been talking about. Let's just say those are fingers that are sticking out, and I don't see them connecting to, I'm assuming, Paul, all of our hazards are covered in the yellow, right? Because that's what we're already.
Yes. Yep.
So that's just an example. I'm seeing core in the dark green. I'm seeing the yellow where we have our other hazards. So I'm very curious about what is that light green area there that doesn't seem to have hazard or core in it, but they're going off in that area. It looks like Alan pointed out that that's not even South Burlington.
Yeah, it's Williston. It's pretty rural there.
Okay.
Paul, you mentioned that the light green was a 300-foot buffer. Is there anything special about that, or is that a
Um,
placeholder?
I guess what I would say is it's sort of the inverse, that the way that one of the ways that Arrowwood did their analysis in order to rank which are the most thriving habitat blocks versus the least ones, you recall that they had 10 different scoring metrics for it. You know, how big is it? How close is it to another one? And one of them was how much of it is considered core forest habitat. And so they defined core as being at least 300 feet away from an edge. So it's not necessarily saying that the quality of the forest of the trees are greater or lesser, but they did make a sort of an analysis that if you're at least 300 feet away from a road or a building or a field, you tend to be in the central part of the forest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, but what it really gets at though is that those are kind of buffer areas, and that what we're really looking to protect is the dark green, and that there might be some wiggle room with the light green.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I'm not a wildlife expert. I guess what I would say is that the areas in the dark green are furthest from human interaction. And so therefore some species do better being further away from humans.
Yeah.
Other humans.
Right. If we were to take,
The tricky part about that is that if you draw the line 300 feet in, then in the future humans are up against what used to be 300 feet away.
right.
Right, I get the concept of a buffer. I'm just wondering, you know, what the scientific basis is of that. And to Monica's point, some of them are kind of fingers that stick out. And, you know, certainly having a buffer around a critical habitat area is important. But, you know, what that needs to be, I guess, is the question.
Right, and one of the things we did talk about was, you know, I guess two things, whether the fingers are important and we would want to continue to have them on the map. And then also, is the light green, kind of that outer area, kind of looked at the same way? Because we did talk about maybe that lighter green would maybe move to a, you know, I guess we're calling them the level 2 resource that would be not necessarily protected at the same level as the darker green core. So I mean, I think we have some choices as to what we do. We could lop them off the map so they're no longer any color and they're just development areas, or we could choose to look at them differently. So I think those are some decisions that might be good to try to get some feedback on as a group.
Have we seen anything from Williston? I mean, this whole area that I know Monica's really interested in, that light color, but this is all along Williston, and I'd be very curious what their map is showing. Because I would think it would sort of be worthwhile to try to be as similar to what they're doing in this particular area. I don't think there's any development that I'm aware of along there.
Ted, I'd be happy to have a conversation with them. Broadly speaking, I know that the southern half of the town, i.e. the part south of 89, is generally considered to be their rural area of the town. They have, using a variety of tools, they have very limited development in that part of the town.
Yeah. The other question, maybe more relevant to what Monica's really trying to get at, about how far we should invade into the lighter green, is there any, I mean, I'm just sort of shooting in the dark and saying, well, yeah, we can go in 100 feet or 200 or 300. I have no basis. And is there any way a forester, like someone at UVM in the forestry department, would have some way to take some students and look around and give us some sort of professional recommendation. And right now I have no idea how to make a determination.
Well, and I have a corollary concern that I expressed last week, and that's the whole concept of invasive species. And, you know, I mean, projects I've been involved with, they actively use herbicides to get rid of invasive species. And so, you know, I know that Arrowwood said that they kind of did their blocks as more of a windshield survey. So I'm concerned with even the dark green and making sure that we're really protecting, you know, key habitat and native forest, and that we're not, you know, chasing off after invasives that, you know, people actively try to, you know, remove and destroy.
But those areas that have been taken over by invasives may well have been forested before, and perhaps consider reforesting when the invasives have been removed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you could just say they're no longer of any value in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, other than I'm not sure that I would like try to protect invasives, you know, maybe, you know, planting native species is, you know, might be an approach, but, you know, I'm just concerned about ground truthing the areas, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Can I make another just consideration? Because, you know, to go into each of these areas very specifically and let us all become the absolute experts in what is contained in any of these areas is, you know, a big task. And we did, as a commission, agree to accept the findings of the Arrowwood report. And I'm looking at it again, and some of the questions that we brought up are addressed in there, and we have agreed to accept that document. If part of our conversation tonight can be kind of to where Bernie's going, if we can discuss, you know, if something is in the light green, if land is in the light green, what within that light green is important to what we've learned? You know, it is maintaining some transition away from the core. You know, these are the things that are important. These are the things, you know, so therefore level 1 or whatever, these are the other things that may be in the light green but are potentially less, like potentially a level 2 if they are farther than 300 feet away from core, if they don't connect to this, if they don't. So if we maybe establish more so we're not looking at, in general, looking at specific areas, but trying to decide, well, of the things we know might be in the light green, which are the most important, and then which might we be willing to say, all right, if it makes sense for housing and for whatever other goals, that makes sense to make secondary versus looking at specific areas.
Duncan, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Kind of getting back to what Monica said earlier about the emails we got, I believe we got one about some of these fingers. And those light green areas are definitely beyond 300 yards from core forest. And, you know, my question is, where do they lead to? What's in them? And, you know, are they, for lack of a better term, are they dead ends for critters? I mean, we don't really know what's in those. I don't know how we verify that those are, you know, critical. I mean, parts of them could be, but, you know, like that one, I think the one, I'm looking at the one off of Spear Street, that's, you know, that looks like that's quite a distance from the core forest. I think it's the one on the Long property that we got the email about. The blue circle around it.
Yeah, there's a few on there.
Yeah, it's got a blue line through it. Yeah, but again, I don't know how do we, without field verifying, I don't know how we know what's in these fingers or some of these light green areas, especially that stick out like the fingers do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we, you know.
Well, see, I don't have any problem with field verifying it. I'm not saying that we have to do it as a commission, or even that we have to have somebody do it for us. What I'm kind of leaning towards is, just like we have, developers hire, a wetlands consultant to delineate wetlands, that, we identify these as potential areas of concern, and then, define, what it is we're looking to save. And it's, maybe native species in a core area, or whatever criteria we come up with. And then, have the developer do a final delineation and tell us how they're going to protect it. And, we can have some mitigation options in there for maybe the light green areas, but, have them come back with a plan that demonstrates that they're protecting, the core areas, and that they've actually gone in the field and looked at those in detail. Because there's really not that many of them. And, I think that the Arrowood report is a good start for us to say, these are the areas, just like, the wetlands map has, these are the wetlands, but you still have to go and delineate them. There isn't any reason why we can't say, these are the areas that we're particularly concerned with. We'd like you to go out and, using some criteria that maybe we develop or whatever, that they go out and do a study and wrap that into the plan that they come up with.
I hear what you're saying, Bernie, but I guess I feel almost the opposite on this one. And the reason that the biggest reason I think I wanted to do the Arrowood study is because if we try to come up with some new criteria for delineation, I think it's so different than wetlands. Like, wetlands is very, very specific. People are trained professionally specifically in that. I think that if you got two people who knew about forests and habitat and got them out there, they would never get the same line. So there's, it's
exactly.
Yeah,
right. But my point is that, if Arrowood had, done a really detailed, thorough, with their expertise, but, what I got out of it was, a lot of it was, windshield survey and aerial mapping. And so that, to me, isn't scientifically defensible, even in terms of, having two experts look at it. I mean, if it was done on the ground and one person, if Arrowood used very specific criteria and did it on the ground and, looked at it in detail, I'd feel a lot better about it. But, using, aerial photography and windshield surveys, I think that then opens it up to greater potential for experts seeing differently on it. And
so
that's what I'm concerned.
Yeah, so I guess just to finish my thought, I don't see these as a delineation. I see these as areas based on the size of and the general type of vegetation that we would be making a policy decision that we want to keep these kind of larger areas that have a lot of trees, and we need to put a line somewhere to kind of reserve them. I see them, I guess I see them a little more like the NRP zone, where the NRP zone was generally based on land use and ecosystem type. And then there was a policy decision about exactly where that line at the edge was and what kinds of things can happen within that zone. But nobody's going out there and ground truthing the line of the NRP. We as a city decided this was generally the area based on generally the type of thing that's going on there that we want to make sure doesn't completely go away. And, maybe that's where this, the non-core area, that light green area comes into play, because we don't know exactly the perfect line. We're giving this 300 foot of I guess, kind of wiggle room that some things can happen within and could be rearranged on a property, you know, to kind of account for that messiness at the edge, you know, where there could be some invasive species. You know, I guess part of it also helps us have a snapshot in time, because, you know, the person who waits another 10 years to do their development and then has to do a delineation of where the trees are, you know, maybe they let trees grow up over a larger portion of their property, and now all of a sudden, if a delineation is done, it would kind of create a bigger forested area on their property. Or conversely, if someone wants to be sneaky, they go ahead and chop down all these trees in anticipation of someone doing a delineation, so it's a smaller area. I think for me, there's the snapshot in time is maybe helpful to some people. And then if we could give flexibility at the edge, you know, then we're really getting that core, you know, we're making sure that there's not encroachments in spots where it's making the connections. Like, to me, it feels like we would be opening up a legal can of worms to create some kind of delineation that no two people would ever get the same. And that makes me really nervous. Like, I just don't see how we could come up with a good enough delineation just based on how many forest types there are and ecosystem types and mixes of, you know, what someone might consider to be good. You know, a scrub forest is so different than a northern hardwood forest. And how do you pick which one's better or good? I mean, I know we can identify invasive species, but, you know, they are often at the edges. So I think it might be better for us to kind of try to preserve the core, maybe come up with some reasonable language about people using the outer portion to kind of maybe tamper some of the concern about the exact edge line. And then, you know, really look at each of these green spots and see if there's policy decisions we need to make. You know, maybe some of these spots are really important for a transportation thing or something on the official map, or, you know, we got some feedback about housing might be maybe more important in some of these spots. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't want to abandon the idea of the shapes that we did have a scientific process to come up with.
So are you advocating then for, you know, and I'm with you on some flexibility in the light green areas, but the second part of what I thought I heard you say was that for some of these dark green areas that we may decide that after all, they're not so important and we may eliminate them?
You know, I think that it seems reasonable to look at them, and, you know, maybe if there's something on the official map in a dark green area, maybe we need to really think about that before we put it into policy. It feels like, you know, there's so few of these areas that it seems like it makes sense to take a look at them. And Paul, maybe you have a better approach. I was kind of rambling.
No,
I get what you're saying, and I agree with where you're headed, I guess.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good discussion. I will say that putting together this map, one thing that I think became very apparent to me, you know, just speaking about the southeast quadrant specifically for a second, the amount of land that is in the green but not in the orange is fairly small. And I might suggest that, you know, starting with the southeast quadrant, you might just decide, make some policy, you know, do a policy review, and instead of having the forest blocks as another layer of review, maybe just decide whether you're going to expand the NRP in these areas or not, and sort of select them, because there's only 8 maybe in the southeast quadrant,
And they're fairly small. Yeah,
Right, they're generally pretty small, and you know, I think that, and one of them, this one down, you probably can't see my mouse.
We can-
One of them is already,
Yeah.
you know, either conserved or built upon based on it being South Village. You know, and then I think for the other ones, you know, once you've got that off the table, it might become a little bit easier to make some policy decisions as you've just been discussing. You know, where do you have other things that are priority, and where are the natural resources the priority?
I can buy into that approach.
Well, Paul, if you make them NRP, they would be developable to 1.2 dwelling units per acre. If you made them NRP, but these are areas which we wouldn't want encroached upon at all.
If they were
The core part.
NRP, then the NRP rules would apply. So the NRP rules say that if you have a parcel less than 15 acres, you can build one house on it. If you have a parcel more than 15 acres, you can have 3 houses on it. And if your parcel is split between the NRP and a development district, you can put 0 in the NRP. So there is some limited development allowed, but we could look on a case-by-case basis and determine whether in any of these parcels that would actually change anything.
Paul, I would like to suggest that if we were to go that route, first of all, I'm more comfortable actually adding core to a hazard or a level 1 Article 12 list, even if it's redundant. But if we were to also go the route of extending the NRP to cover the core, I would suggest that we somehow provide opportunity for other areas that have previously been deemed NRP without the kind of detailed mapping that we have now, to at least, you know, what if there's something within the NRP that is potentially good housing area that does not have hazards in it, does not have habitat blocks. You know, if we're going to add 5% of the NRP, is there another 5% that can be meaningful to a buildable area? So I would just ask for some way to have that consideration done.
Well, it feels to me like it might be easier to just use the habitat lines than, I mean, rather than adding and subtracting, but that's just an initial thought. Like it is a good suggestion though.
I agree that I think adding to Article 12 for right now is the most streamlined, but I do think this overall look could be very helpful.
Yeah.
But it sounds like we don't really have much of a disagreement about protecting core, right? And then so the question is, what do we mean by protect? And then, except, you know, perhaps in a few areas, but when we speak of core, I don't know what those would be. Personally, I would see the habitat connectors as being also very important. However, a connector can be moved. So I don't know if the connector is something that gets the kind of level 1 that allows you to relocate it if it meets certain criteria. But in terms of the core, do we generally all agree that the cores should be, I don't know, a level 1 or a hazard in Article 12? Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me, but you know, we're floundering around about how to define this core and then the 300-foot buffer. And Bernie made the point that there needs to be some sort of scientific or at least valid determination. And perhaps we should use some of the state's resources to help us delineate these things on the ground. You know, maybe what's his name, Ethan Tapper, the state forester, could be shanghaied into doing this work for us, or press ganged into doing this. That's just an idea that came to mind because we seem to be struggling with this.
Well, but when it comes to core, we accepted the Arrowwood findings. Paul, do you think that in terms of core, does the Arrowwood report give the city the details needed to potentially establish a very clear delineation for core?
Well, I think in response to that, what I was advocating for was that, you know, that core line, the dark green, becomes just an area on our map that we protect at the level that we've talked about protecting, generally no building. But then maybe that 300-foot outer area is like because we don't have a perfect ground truthing of the edge, that becomes a partially developable area, like something we generally don't, more of a level 2, like it's on the map, you know, if possible, not develop it, you know, it will be a priority for the conservation PUDs, but it's not taken away completely from a landowner for usage, something like that maybe.
So low density, you're thinking of very low density development, Jessica?
I mean, potentially, it feels like it could be one way to, you know, because we don't have a perfect line on the ground that was done by ground truthing, it could serve to be that flexible zone.
So-
Duncan, do you have your hand up?
Bernie had his hand up.
I'm sorry,
Well, so did Duncan. Whatever.
I was just thinking, you know, what you were talking about is, I went back and I read Article 12 about the habitat blocks and then habitat disturbance assessment, and I'm thinking where in the process would that delineation of that 300-foot buffer fall? Is that in the habitat disturbance assessment that we would work that into there when the landowner dealt with that? Just trying to think of where.
I guess I was thinking the line would be as defined by Arrowwood, except in areas where we as a group choose to take it out of the habitat blocks. Like maybe the fingers we were talking about, like you actually said, Duncan, if it's a finger that's only the light green and it leads to nowhere, it's actually a discussion I think we should really come to an end of. Is it leading wildlife to a dead end? And you know, I think that that's a really valid question.
So I just have a question on lines, I guess, and maybe it's a question for Paul, and maybe you can remind me. But so part of using the dark green and the light green from Arrowwood, my question is, are those boundaries related to anything? And maybe I'll go back to the NRP. Are the edges and the boundaries on the NRP related to roads or property lines or things like that? And then the follow-on question is, are the lines on Arrowwood's report for the dark green and the light green related to anything on the ground? And specifically what I'm getting at is ultimately somebody's going to go out and they're going to want to do a development, and they're going to, you know, do a land survey of the boundaries and all that other stuff. But, how do we tie these boundaries in to reality on the ground? And if they're already along roads and property lines, then that makes sense. But if they're just kind of, blobs on a map, then I question, how we fine tune that to make it usable for people.
Right. Okay. So Bernie, I'll start with the NRP question. So the NRP, when it was put in, replaced a former system where there was development areas and restricted areas. And the restricted areas were areas of additional sensitivity that you had to ask the DRB for permission to build in. When the NRP came in, it was actually Arrowwood way back then who'd done the analysis, and they looked at a few sort of key core areas based on wetlands largely, but also some other features and farmland. And then the Planning Commission added buffers to some of those. So for example, around South Village and South Point, the NRP is a 300-foot buffer to the outside of the wetlands. That's where the drawing was made. Elsewhere, it was made to be connections between areas, and it was entirely policy-based. I think there was also some work done to try to even things out a little bit so that, you know, a property owner who happened to be, you know, have a lot of farmland wasn't entirely put in the NRP. So it was policy-based in part, but rooted in where there was active agriculture and where there was habitat wetland areas, and where Arrowwood generally identified corridors that the city then tried to find the most opportunities to build upon, recognizing existing development.
But are the edges defined in any way?
The edges are defined by the map.
And that's all. So somebody has to look at this map and essentially, you know, eyeball where the edge is then.
Well, I mean, I mean, it's measurable as with anything GIS, but yes, it's a policy map, just like a zoning district is a policy map.
Okay.
But Paul, is the ground staked at, because the zoning goes by lot lines generally,
Generally, but not always.
Okay, is the NRP flagged in any way on the ground? Like, are there markers on the ground? No.
No. There is the ability, and you've had one request in front of you, somebody could go to the Planning Commission under the current regulations and ask for some interpretation of where a line is. But the LDRs generally have guidance that it says, you know, if it looks like a line is supposed to be following a stream, it's supposed to be following a stream. If it looks like it's supposed to be following a property line, it's following a property line. But in the NRP's case, a lot of it is, it's mapped, and that's the source of it.
And then is it the DRB that's ensuring that a plan is meeting what the map shows the NRP to be?
Yep. So on any application to the Development Review Board, the plan has to show the zoning boundaries. The DRB has an authority in the current regulations to adjust the regulations, the applicability of the regulations 50 feet on one side or the other side. So that gives them a little bit of room to adjust for circumstances. And they see a fair number of applications that are sort of saying, well, what if I add 50 feet to the district in this side, and then I take it away on the other side, and we do it, and it's even, and the DRB has the authority to do that.
So then are we kind of maybe thinking that these greens would kind of be treated the same way?
That's kind of what I was thinking, because it takes the legal issues of a ground truth delineation kind of off the table, and we've created a policy district, you know, based on information that we have on where we want this type of protection to exist. So it would be similar to NRP and could be administratively mapped the same way.
So the proposal that's on the table from Paul then is essentially to take everything that's kind of green on, say, the southern half of this and just extend the boundaries of the NRP to cover the green and the light green. And then for the areas that, say, are on the northern half of this, those we would look at individually and decide whether we want to keep the greens and then how we want to regulate dark greens and the light greens.
Well, I guess I'd say, Bernie, I still would recommend that there be a review of the ones in the south as to whether you want to add them to the NRP, because there may be policy reasons that you don't want to do it.
Okay,
or that
that's
you do.
fine.
And I'm not intending to lead you in one direction or the other, but you know.
No, that's fine. I thought it was just a clarifying question. So
Yep.
I'm fine with that.
Right, and based on that, I mean, what I would think might be reasonable is to consider a dark green plus, given what you just said, Paul, about, you know, it not being perfectly flagged and that the DRB needs to have this little bit of flexibility, it's potentially the dark green with like a 100-foot buffer rather than the 1 meter.
Right. Well, I guess keep in mind also that this is where this, you know, once you've decided where it does and doesn't apply by cutting off the line, then that's where the conservation PUD comes in. If a property happens to be heavily covered in natural resources. And so the guidance that you can give about whether it's 100 feet or 300 feet or whatever can be priorities for conservation or not. You know, and that's why I sort of in my staff notes had recommended if there are areas of the city where you don't want it to be going through the conservation PUD process, where you might say, like in the city center form-based code area, the priority is that we build neighborhoods, not that we try to balance the two. Then that's a discussion to be had. But there are other areas where you might, you know, just want to say, give those rankings, and that's where that the core versus the outer can be.
Any thoughts on that approach? I mean, it seems like a good thing to do. We did get some feedback by email already. I know that one of them came right before the meeting, so we probably didn't all get a chance to look at that. But we got information from Alan Long, really specific to the finger idea, you know, where these light green pieces kind of jut out and don't necessarily lead to anything. And he pointed out a few different spots where that's the case. That I think we'd want to look at as part of that process, as well as we received an additional map and email from Leslie Blackmo, which was kind of highlighting specific areas, you know, where these habitat blocks and the connectors are in the on the same parcel as ones that they have found in the case for housing to be kind of priority or residential, or will be good for residential development. So it feels like it's maybe too big of a process to do that all tonight. Like, what do you think the best approach is? Maybe to solicit additional input. I know we did get these 2 emails, but maybe didn't hear from everyone, and then schedule another time to really like where everyone's clear that that's the plan and we're going to zoom into these areas and really talk about each one.
Or Jessica, can I suggest that you also look at the opposite of that, which is, and I'm not implying that there's like a blanket acceptance of this map with the circles from Alan Long, but could we also look at the reverse of those that were highlighted, if they are in fact, you know, outside of the core, if there aren't hazards under them, is there any reason that we wouldn't consider those? And who would be the one to answer that? Is that something that, you know, Paul and crew could take a look at more closely to understand what is contained within those areas? Because, you know, maybe those are good suggestions, but maybe there are hazards under there that we do need to protect.
Well, if there are hazards under there, then there's nothing to protect. You're already protecting them.
So these greens, the dark greens and the light greens are really, again, just to make sure and summarize, are really areas that aren't otherwise regulated.
Correct.
And Jessica's suggestion, which I think is a good one, is we really need to, and I think you mentioned it, Paul, is kind of go through these and decide if there's other policy concerns where, and again, kind of on the southern half where maybe, you know, we add them to the NRP or we remove them or we tweak them somehow. And then, you know, for the northern part, I think we would look at them too, but have them be maybe separate from the NRP, but kind of look at them, I guess, is where we're at, right?
Yeah, and I guess, you know, looking at this map as a whole, and I'm happy to send this out to you so you can look at it. We're really talking, you know, in terms of substantive change, there's maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas total that are substantively different. We're talking about more than a couple hundred feet one way or the other. So, you know, I guess if you wanted, staff could take a look at the ones that are a little less consequential and then highlight the ones that are for you. And, you know, give you a recommendation on the smaller ones, and then have you really focus on the larger ones.
Yeah, that would be fine with me. I mean, I think ultimately, you know, Jessica's suggestion is maybe have you do that and get another round of feedback from the public and then come back and kind of fine tune these as far as, well, essentially, what do we want to do with them?
Well, but you know, I just want to say, I mean, we are here in a special meeting. Rather than just going back to staff on it, is there some stuff that we can just dive into right now? Maybe if we even just take one as an example, because we might find that we as a group can get through this and then not have to wait for another meeting to discuss it again. If there are some, like Paul, maybe would you suggest some that you'd like us to just right now to discuss, and maybe we can see what we come up with?
Yeah, I have one thing that might make sense for us to talk about. And John Simpson, are you trying to get our attention, or if you're not, would you mind turning your video off? If you're not trying to get our attention. Thanks. So what I was going to say is, I think maybe if we zoomed into one of those finger locations where it's just the light green that juts out, I just want to get maybe a little bit of feedback. Like there's one, there's a bunch of them. This one's fine.
That's the one we got the email about, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. And so I guess, you know, here there's kind of two of them, because there's the core, that dark green. And then there's two different spots. Actually, there's one on the other side of the orange too, but where there's a light green that kind of juts out from it. And I guess I just wondered what people might need to be able to say whether or not they think that these should continue to be kind of regulated as the buffer versus maybe chopped off.
And Paul, what is the blue? What's the blue outline?
The blue outline is the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory that might not be as good a quality as some of the other ones. So the areas in the blue are showing up in that layer as a wetland, but as you can see, there's, you know, big chunks of 2 neighborhoods that are in the middle of it. So it's probably not as good a data as some of the other data.
Mm-hmm. Well, can I throw my 2 cents out on this particular one as an example? And let me just see, Jessica, if this is the kind of feedback you're looking for. So for example, when I look at that, I'm looking at on the top, the north side or the top, that there is a direct connection to another yellow parcel, which is either NRP or protected in some way. So there's some kind of potential connection that northern portion, the northern finger plays, right? That seems to provide something. Whereas when I compare that to the finger at the southern side, that's where I'm not seeing the connection to another habitat block. I don't know, right, so if a wetland assessment in fact showed that there weren't wetlands under there, to me, there's opportunity to perhaps minimize some of the southern end of that. But the northern end, to me, because of that connection between the two yellows, seems more important.
Well, and maybe I can just sort of jump into this one to give you a little bit of the sort of non-natural resource context here. So this area up here, this is yellow because it was zoned NRP. It was NRP because that was to be purchased as part of a city park. All of this is the Underwood property on the north end of this. Here, you've got a roadway that's been built right there as part of South Point. And here you've got a roadway that's been built as part of South Village. And then there's going to be a rec path built here. So, something you may wish to consider is, maybe the line should be there. Ensuring that whatever happens on the far side of the road, where this neighborhood's already built out, they've already used all the density, is protected, is further protected, and then the roadway is able to continue connecting two neighborhoods. Just a thought is, looking at the context here.
Yeah, so that's your feedback was exactly what I was looking for. And I think that it really piggybacks on what Duncan was saying earlier, and why I thought maybe if we could just talk about this type of example, it might just help us get to the next step. Because I think I would agree with kind of what Paul and Monica were just saying. Like, if there's a connection being made, seems like that is really important.
Right.
But
now, on the other hand, just to sort of give the other side of it, if you don't feel that connecting two neighborhoods is important in that context, then you can consider extending the forested area further out. I mean, that's the policy choice, and there's really not, the science of this can help, but this is a policy choice of what do you want to put first in these areas.
Well, but to me, it's less about, when I gave my comment, it was less about what I would see going there, right? Versus the upper part seems a clear connection to all across that northern border, but that southern piece does seem to be specifically isolated. So I would be looking for other fingers that are well outside of the core, that do not seem to have any other overlapping hazards or anything else as an element in itself that makes it less significant. If the owner of the property or the developer wanted to maintain it and turn it into a conservation PUD or something, that is great. But from a policy perspective, it seems like the part that needs to be protected is, I like what you just said, Paul, about to the other side of the roadway.
Michael, were you saying something? Was that?
No, I was trying to get this map on my computer, and I seem to have lost it because this is for Paul, when I click on it, I'm asked to log in, and I have, username and password. City of South Burlington. So I don't see it on my computer anymore. This map that we're playing with.
Oh, it should just be a screen share for you, Michael. I can make this available for viewing after the meeting, or whenever for folks. I just have to hit some extra buttons to do that.
Is the green area, what is the green area zoned?
The green area on this map is zoned neighborhood residential. The NRP ends at the yellow. The yellow is the boundary currently.
But Paul, isn't the green also protected because that was part of the internal transfer of TDR density?
Yes, so this part of the green here that I'm circling has been protected as part of the internal TDR transfer. This
And
part
then this-
here is part of the adjacent property, so it's not part of South Point.
That's not part of
Okay.
the,
This is South Point here.
and that's preserved.
That's been protected.
I was just going to, Jessica, in this exercise we're doing, and I would agree with Monica, looking at this area here, that southern little finger there, it's between two developments. You know, I would think that that's an area we would say, okay, maybe we want some development there if it's going to happen. The other part I agree with, but I think that's a perfect example of an area. It's right between two developments. I actually know that area because I walked through there, and it kind of dead ends at the old, you know, the old farm there, and you're right on Spear Street. So I think that's a perfect example of an area where we could say, yeah, we could, especially if that roadway is going to go through there, we would lop off part of that and say, okay, that's an area that, yes, could be developed.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Duncan and Monica on that. You know, the northern part, it sounds like it's already conserved, but I think the general criteria of, you know, trying to connect protected areas and conserve those is good. And I also agree with Duncan that in areas where you have, you know, development on both sides, it doesn't really make sense to have an undeveloped finger in the middle. It seems like you'd want to just, you know, that's where we would want to fill out in order to, you know, maintain conservation elsewhere.
Right. So this is really, I think, perfect feedback. And I think I can see doing this same process kind of as we zoom around the map. I don't know if it's the next time we get together, but in a near future meeting where we can kind of talk through these individually. And it seems like it would be helpful to have maybe some recommendations from staff on things like exactly what you just said, Paul, like, you know, this is a spot where we would connect to neighborhoods, or this is a spot where there's something on the official map. I know you had a few examples of those in our memo for today, that we could kind of move around and have this same type of discussion together.
Well, and along those lines, Paul, you just circled an area which apparently is going to be protected somehow that's still shown as green. So if, you know, there's been, you know, some kind of agreement or deal made, you know, maybe we should be changing the color on some of those.
We can try to do that, yes. You know, I was trying to put the mapping together generally to cover the resources. It's a little bit tricky to get every single condo association's agreement, but I think we can get close.
Well, it's just that where we're ultimately headed is trying to determine which of these greens, you know, we really want to focus our regulatory effort on. And
Right.
You know, if there's some that, you know, we can scab onto the NRP, if there's some that are more applicable to development, if there's some that are already somehow protected, you know, we don't want to expend our very limited energy on those. We want to look at,
Right.
and I think our basic criteria of, you know, trying to connect things that need to be connected and trying to build in areas where it makes sense to be built are two good kind of basic criteria. But, you know, understanding, you know, what's kind of already off the table would be good, so that we're not spending a whole bunch of time like talking about this northern green finger when it's already taken care of through some other mechanism.
That seems reasonable. I think at the same time, I would, you know, encourage that you spend some time on areas where, you know, maybe there's some large areas and it really is a policy discussion. So Ted,
Yeah.
you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting the hill farm here.
Yep.
There's a variety of quality of forest areas. You can see, you know, if you're looking really closely here, that's sort of, you know, not very forested in some areas and then fairly forested in others. But I think, you know, larger than that is the question of what do you want to see policy wise in terms of this property and this area of the city? You know, do you want to say wherever the most significant forests there, that's what you want to protect? Do you want to be leaning towards the side of protection to add to Wheeler Nature Park next door? Or do you want to be saying, you know, this is a prime area for having future neighborhoods, and that's where you tilt the balance? And that's really, you know, we can give recommendations in that, but to me, that's the heart of this, of your work here, of how do you balance out the needs of the city?
So can I ask a question here, guys? Sorry, I feel like I'm being a gatekeeper, but the previous example we just went through, there are not many, but a few of them, and they're just as quickly looked at, I think. It would be fantastic if we could just knock a number of them out tonight and let a revised map come back to show us what the implications are. And then maybe some of these bigger ones that have more policy, we can then discuss separately. But we just spent, I think, too much time on that one other example, where if we just start going through some of them, I think we might all have some very similar agreements, and then we don't have to wait to have that conversation again. Are people willing to try to get through some more of those tonight?
I would. I am just looking at our agenda. So it did move us on at 8:15. We're a little bit over to the planned unit development types discussion, kind of our next topic. So I guess I'm not sure if we should, like, now that we have a good approach, maybe we can move into the next time we talk about it with a good approach and some prepared notes on each spot.
Yeah,
I would
I'm
just
not sure.
suggest that I would just say that this stuff is very detail oriented, and once we're in it, it's really helpful to just stay in it and get through it. Because when we revisit it again, we might spend a half of the meeting just getting back into some of the details. So I hear you, but yeah.
I'm not sure we have enough detailed mapping at our disposal to do this work, you know, at this meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, some of us can do some homework and come back with it next time. But doing it on the fly now, I'm not comfortable with that.
Would it be helpful for me to select some areas for you and give you some notes on what we know about that area? It might be one or it might be multiple parcels, but to give you some to give you some notes as a starting point for each of you know, say, pick a bunch of these and do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. We can do that.
Paul, can I add, if there's, you know, I hate to use this term, but if there's any low-hanging fruit that could easily be knocked off, I don't know if you could give us some recommendations on that. I'm just looking at the corner of Van Sicklen and Heinsberg Road, that finger there, thinking, as Monica said, that could probably be a pretty quick conversation. I don't know if we could somehow, you could come back to us and say, you know, that might be one that would be pretty easy to go done. I'm not sure if you're comfortable doing that or not.
I'm comfortable with doing as much as that as you'd like, as long as I always say, as long as you're comfortable with rejecting what I have to say.
No problem.
Okay. Well, let's plan to do that then.
Okay.
And Paul, and does everybody agree that, Paul, while you're doing that, would you maybe just keep in mind these two documents that we received from the public comment from Leslie and Alan? Maybe that can, and then that will help us just put it all together.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
And I'll share this mapping presentation with you so you can look at it in a little more detail the way that we looked at it tonight.
Yeah, thank you for putting it together, Paul. It's really well organized. So we can move on to the next item. So looking at the PUD applicability.
All right, so you've seen versions of this before, and I apologize for the sketchiness of the drawings here, but basically what staff and the consultant is recommending is that your lower density residential and mixed-use districts, with the exception of the NRP, would be allowed to be traditional neighborhoods. Hang on, let me just pull this map up. That the areas that are sort of medium intensity, so the areas, say, along Kennedy Drive, Swift Street, Allen Road, the corner of Kimball Avenue and Kennedy, and possibly the Hill Farm, have the option of being either a TND or a neighborhood commercial center. And that the areas that are your high intensity areas, like along Shelburne Road and possibly at the corner of Kennedy and Williston Road, that those be the areas where the option is to be if they meet the threshold of a PUD, of being a neighborhood commercial district. So a place like what the Larkin family is doing at the corner of Fayette Road and Shelburne Road. And then the second map here, as we had talked about, the idea would be that conservation PUDs are an option. They would be an option in any of these low density districts. So basically anywhere in the southeast quadrant that allows for development along the waterfront, in the R2 and R1 districts along Swift Street, and then also any property that happens to be more than 70% covered in natural resources, regardless of their zoning district. This does not break out the discussion that you had a couple weeks ago about, are there areas where you might want to allow for large lot development, that kind of thing. That's sort of the next fine grain, but this was sort of the big picture. The one thing that this does not have in it is it does not cover the commercial, the industrial areas like Tech Park and Meadowland Business Park. Staff's guidance to the consultant was, while those are important areas, the city, that we didn't want the good to be the enemy of the great of getting this project done. So we really strongly recommended that they focused on these more neighborhood type areas first and get that done.
I have a question.
Sure.
So on the upper map,
Yep.
and you mentioned the Hill Farm, it seems like that's the only one that you would be, that would kind of be a zoning change for them, right?
It would be a zoning change.
But that's
currently
only
it's zoned
one?
industrial.
Yeah.
So I have sort of a two-part answer to that question. Yes, that would be a zoning change because it's currently zoned industrial. The comprehensive plan called that property out, or at least a portion of that property out, for being changed towards something that's more mixed use. Staff's sort of gone back and forth on whether there should be any other underlying zoning district changes. The difference between them is if you don't, the underlying zoning district may help influence the building types that are allowable within a particular PUD. So you might have a TND in one area that allows for single family, two family, triplex and fourplexes, but you might have another one in a higher density zoning district where maybe you can put a 8plex or a 10plex in. That's a little bit of fine tuning, and we do have some recommendations for you as to, based on your conversations about a year ago, as to what zoning districts to change, and we're ready to bring that to you, but it doesn't fundamentally change which PUD types would be allowed.
So, well, based on that, so I guess that's just pointing that out. Are we comfortable acknowledging that there might be a allowable zoning change or different use than zoning with this? But second to that, I wanted to just say, I know that we're not we're not making campus PUDs a priority, but I think I did send the Google corporate corporate campus that they're working on, and they are including employee housing on their campus. And I wanted to propose that when the time is right, the industrial open space that's across the way from there, that be a permitted use in that zone, which is open space industrial. So that too would be a potential zoning shift, but maybe it would have certain parameters. So I know it's not a priority for now. I just wanted to put that out there, that I think that would be an interesting thing to add across the way.
We have some materials and some thoughts ready for you as soon as you have bandwidth to take on those topics, and would love to engage with that.
So, and then I also just wanted to say that in the Affordable Housing Committee meeting today, with all of this type of conversation, the Affordable Housing Committee would like to make sure that they are included in an agenda to discuss all of this and how it relates to the changes to the calculations for affordability. So in an upcoming meeting, if you guys would be willing to commit to giving some agenda space to how affordability fits into this, that would be appreciated.
Ted, you want to go?
Yeah, I've always liked the idea of the campus style, like what Monica's referring to. But going to the Hill area, I'm rethinking that and thinking maybe that should be all residential, because it's residential to the south and it's residential to the west. And, you know, it may be possible. I'd rather have residential than the Dewdrop motel or something on the corner. You know, I think there was some discussion of maybe a hotel there or whatever, but I'd opt for housing.
So Ted, the difference between a TND and an NCD would be, you know, typically a TND would have a little bit of commercial, but it's very neighborhood scale commercial. So it would be, you know, a coffee shop, a corner store, that kind of thing. It basically is whatever the underlying zoning district allows, which in most of these areas is just residential, and then a handful of neighborhood service uses. An NCD typically has, it's still related to the underlying zoning, but your underlying zoning might allow more to it, and you can scale that however you want. So you could say, you know, something to medium grocery store, offices, or you could have much larger. That's really up to you. I know that Jeff Nick has expressed interest in doing, you know, some kind of a business headquarters and then sort of fading into a residential and small scale commercial neighborhood. But this is your policy choice as to how you go about it. So you could say that you're turning it into an R7 district, sort of like along Kennedy Drive, and then you're making it a traditional neighborhood development. So there can be small scale stores and maybe, you know, a small dentist office kind of thing, and then the rest of it becomes residential.
Let's remember that a good chunk of that is this core habitat that's not otherwise protected.
It is, but it's a very large property, Monica. It's 110 acres. So even if half of it was forest, you're still speaking about one of, if not the largest, remaining piece of land of the city.
Right. I'm just saying
50 acres.
Just to keep in mind that it is bordering on that. So whatever the uses are, it would be nice to complement the natural environment that's by it.
Oh, what is the Ride development just south of that?
It is almost just south of it. There's two small properties in between them.
And is the Ride development? I mean, I know it wasn't a PUD. Is there some commercial in front of that?
There is. So where the Ride development was built, the zoning that's in place today has a small commercial zone along Heinsberg Road on purpose to create a little bit of a neighborhood commercial area, and then it was residential behind. That's how the current zoning deals with that.
Paul, go ahead.
Isn't that zoning as it is to keep open the possibility of a 12B, exit 12B.
The 12B is in the official map and the comprehensive plan, Paul. Yes. So I think that
I
part of
didn't
the
understand
reason.
that. Could you repeat that, Paul?
I think the zoning for that piece of property is as it is to leave open the possibility of an exit 12B. That was my understanding of it.
20 years out.
Yeah, I
now?
would say that, you know, whether
20
it's the
years out from
industrial,
20 years ago or when?
yeah. Certainly that's I think, Paul, you're hitting the nail on the head there, that's going to be an important decision point associated with, do you want that to be a high intensity area or not? Because an interstate exit sort of wants to be high intensity near it.
Right.
I look forward to
Well,
that
that boils
discussion.
back to the original discussion we had a little while ago, evaluating these individual green areas and deciding to what extent we want to keep them. So, you know, that may be one where, you know, we have development all around that we just decide to not use that one. But, you know, subject to future conversation, I'm sure, but.
We're getting some kind of feedback. I don't know if people could mute if you're not speaking. And then does anybody have any other comments or questions about this?
Well, on the Hill Farm property, yeah, about a third of it on the western side is forested and maybe protected, but it's also contiguous to the south with the Wheeler Nature Park and another open property that's supposed to be parkland according to the Act 250 permit that pertains to it. So both on the west and the south, there should be some kind of transition from whatever we're going to do with it to a natural area.
Michael, what I can do to help with that is, for the last conversation, I can zoom in on that area and show where the forested areas relate to what you just discussed, and then you can from there decide whether more transition is needed, whether that suffices, whether that's doing the job. It sounds like
Yeah.
that property in particular should get more attention, which sounds great. I'm happy to help facilitate that.
There's also a 500-year or 0.2% floodplain on the western side of it.
Sorry, Paul, just so I'm understanding, the lighter blue is the higher density and commercial use than the darker blue.
The lighter blue would allow either the TND or the NCD. So it lets somebody choose which one they want to do.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that. You could just say this is going to be one or the other, but this gives a little more flexibility for a developer to decide which path they want to take. An NCD is more intense.
And is the exit 12B right there?
It's right where that dot says 89.
But do we know, I mean, where that stands?
Yes.
I know it was in that report. I'm just.
Yep. The CCRPC is working with the towns right now. They narrowed the corridor study down to 3 places to be looking at, 13, 12B, and 14. And I gather that they're currently working to try to whittle that down to 1 or 2 options to be looking at closely. I think that their target is within the next 8 to 12 months to have recommendations, including the city's decision about what we want to do. They've been very clear that ultimately the RPC only wants to recommend something if the city also wants to recommend it. So stay tuned. This is a very active discussion, and we strongly encourage you to participate in the council discussions, and we're happy to bring them to you also. The RPC has offered to come to whomever and talk it through. So
just from a timing perspective for interim zoning and PUDs, how important is it to decide what color that particular parcel is at this moment?
yes, it depends on whether you get an application.
Well, but right now it couldn't have any residential.
Right.
So if
It can. You can have very limited, but I think you could have 30 homes on the whole 108 acres.
Right, it's
So
one
for-
home per 3 acres currently zoned on
oh,
the
I
residential side.
thought it was industrial open space.
It,
Oh, but
it
because of the open-
effectively is the highest and best use is industrial commercial, because you can only put one house every 3 acres if you're doing residential.
The open, okay, yeah. I mean, personally, I'm fine with leaving it up to what whoever owns the property would want to do. So giving them the flexibility. If we had to make a decision tonight, I would say for that particular area, giving the landowner the flexibility, the option with the higher flexibility. But
Just think about-
So I
Just think
guess the
of all
broader
the
question,
housing
Paul,
you
is,
can have
are
there
you
along
looking
the road.
for us to approve your sketch as what we're looking for, or is this just information to chew on at this point?
I guess I would say, as much as you're ready to say that it's in the right direction, the better. You know, if you say this property is one you need to think on a little bit more, but broadly speaking, it seems like this is we're in the right path, then that's very helpful. If you're saying we're not sure about any of this, then that's okay too. But as much as you feel comfortable saying that we're on the right track with, it gives our consultant something to work from.
Okay, so broadly speaking, I think it's headed in the right direction. And as far as that particular property, I think the recommendation to allow a little flexibility is fine.
Well, can I just ask why the Farrell lakefront property, wasn't that a parcel that was on the open space recommendation as something to conserve? Are we opening that area up to something that that's a very special parcel?
Right.
Do we want
So
that
the
to be
current
dark
zoning on that property is, if you're a PUD under the current rules, and you protect an area to be a park, then it's 7 units per acre development potential on the property today. So the proposal here is that it would have the option for being a conservation PUD, and also a traditional neighborhood. There's also a forest block on a chunk of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, to the extent that you have any guidance to help the council to understand what they should be thinking about in terms of non-regulatory tools, this is a good example of helping them along their path also.
You had your hand up?
So we paid for it, so we probably need to come back to the city.
Ed, were you going to say something?
We were, like, itching to get home again, but actually.
Okay, any other comments on this, or should we look at the conservation one? A little more detailed?
Yeah, just to finish, I'm okay with some flexibility on the Hill Farm, but I'm very interested and concerned that there should be, that the western part, the forested part and the forest buffer should be protected, as well as some form of natural area where it's contiguous with current open space and the Wheeler Park. I'm also one of those people who doesn't think that the Swift Street extension is a good idea. Apart from anything else, it would have to cross a class 2 wetland. And so I have some concerns about just saying, okay, let the developer do whatever he likes with it.
Yeah, I think, the overarching point of all of this zoning is that the developers aren't going to get to just do whatever they like. They'd have to, set aside anything in chapter 12. Like you said, if we protect the florist block there, we wouldn't develop that portion. And then, any development that does happen has to adhere to all the other rules in the PUD. So, I think that, it's not totally willy-nilly. They're getting to choose between two different types, or three different types,
Right, but this is, to Michael's point, this is exactly where the last conversation and this conversation come together, which is, for a property like the Hill Farm, I've drawn the marker across the entirety of the parcel, but in reality, let's say the property owner chose to be a TND, the first thing they have to do is remove anything that's a hazard or a level 1 resource, which is whatever you choose to be the key forest areas. That comes off the top, and then the rest is the neighborhood. And if you choose to have sort of in-between areas that are level 2s, then the DRB would review that on a case-by-case basis.
Right, and that's why I was saying, knowing that I know Bernie mentioned that maybe we look at that natural area. I too, like Michael, support protecting that core along the western side of that property, but that's why I also would want to give the landowner the flexibility on the buildable side to do whatever seems right. And surely that landowner is going to be watching very closely whatever the decision is about this exit as well, and want to do something appropriate to that. So,
Ted?
Monica, you've been really pushing more housing. I don't understand why you wouldn't really have interest in putting housing here.
I'm not saying not putting housing there. I'm just suggesting, is it like a Farrell Street kind of markets and housing? But I mean, if it's going to be right at an exit.
Well, that's debatable as well. That's debatable as well, I think.
Well, right, and so the landowner will need to be prepared for that. I mean, this is currently zoned industrial, and nothing industrial has happened. So I think that surely residential is going to be something that is going to be considered there. I just don't know that it has to be only, personally, I don't know that it has to be only residential, but that's just my opinion.
Right. Well, and we can, we can continue this discussion if you want when we bring back the charts of exactly what the three different PUD types are, because they're all shades of one another. They all contain some level of residential and some level of commercial, but it's the tilt as to what the emphasis is of it.
Did anybody have any comments or questions on the purple zones, the conservation PUD applicability? It looks like that's a pretty good map area. Oh.
I think that's good feedback for tonight. I think that gives us a lot to work with and a couple properties to hone in on, which is perfectly fine.
Can I just ask so the conservation of what looks like it's going over Eastwoods, though? I'm looking sideways here. The part on the north that's just south of 89, isn't that?
That's the Edlin property.
That's the
part of it is Edlin, part of them, and there's a few other properties, and you're right, a piece of it is Eastwoods, which we've started a conversation with UVM about thinking about differentiating some of their districts to be a little more reflective of actual policy instead of just putting them all as institutional agricultural.
Okay, that's a flag then. What, I don't understand what this purple is doing then. I was reading this as not just conserved, it's not conserved land, it's conservation PUD is how I was reading that.
Correct.
So this.
So probably that parcel exactly where the Eastwoods natural area would come out of this. That was probably my markering too quickly on that one.
Okay, but then you're proposing to change the ag ed in all of their.
No, I didn't touch that subject yet. I guess you'll still have to decide whether you want to do any zoning changes or not. The relationship between how the exemptions for institutional development under Vermont law separate from housing is a little bit tricky. But I guess the Edlin property request is still out there for you to consider. So I didn't put it in the TND, but I guess I did probably draw a little bit quickly, and you'll need to be deciding what you want to do about the request that was put in front of you a year or two ago.
But I'm still confused because when we're looking at our Article 12, that whole area is covered with the slopes and the water and then the forest blocks. I don't even know that there's any space for on that northern part north of Swift Street there. That's why I'm just surprised to see this there at all when we're still talking about where all of our hazards are. I just think that might be a little bit misleading and.
Well, keep in mind that the point of a big part of the point of a conservation PUD is to deal with a property that is substantially covered in resources to give them the economic value of the property while conserving the majority of it. So if you know, setting aside the UVM property for a second, where it says R1 PRD on the map here, you're right, it is that's privately owned land, and that is substantially covered in forest areas. That's what the conservation PUD is trying to address specifically.
So I would just ask if you're going, and maybe if other people disagree, but I mean, if we're going to talk about on UVM land, adding some of this purple, that's to me sending a message that we're open to altering the zoning, which maybe we are. I don't know. I'm just saying, I don't know that we're having that conversation right now. So to me, that purple should be limited to the R1 PRD land. And it should not be right?
I agree with Monica on that. We have not yet considered any zoning change request, and you can be sure that I would be opposed to it because I think that's one of the most valuable natural resources we have. You know, you talk about
to leave out the institutional agricultural land for now until you pending any decision that you've made.
Yeah, I mean, I'm cool with eventually talking about it, but it seems not part of the purview for right now.
Yeah, it's a good point. It wasn't listed in the chart that listed the zoning districts that were applicable. Right. So, Duncan, did you have something?
Yeah, no, I guess it goes along with what Monica was just talking about. I mean, I'm looking at the unprotected core forest, and that's a big chunk of it. That's probably the biggest chunk other than the Hill Farm in South Burlington that we have contiguous. So I mean, we are going to have to make a decision about that property. Are we going to conserve it, or are we going to allow some sort of conservation PUD there?
Yeah.
Right. Or the third option, which is that it remains institutional agricultural as its zoning district, and then you address how you want to deal with it within that, because you're not required to change the zoning from what it is.
But Paul, just to play devil's advocate here, if we say, you know, we want to conserve that core forest, we don't want any building there, and then UVM comes and says, we're going to put some dorms there, I mean, they're still beholden to that zoning though, yes?
They are beholden to the zoning that says it has to be something related to a campus. It is, there's a special area of Vermont law for zoning that sort of restricts the extent to which you can regulate educational, municipal, other types of facilities. So I think we're going to have to sharpen our pencils a little bit more on what would happen if you had both a forest block and they decide to come in with dorms or classrooms or whatever.
Well, and that's where, do they need to follow Article 12? So
that's
if
what we need to sharpen our pencil on, and I will.
Okay. Which is
look into
another
that.
reason to, yeah, okay. So yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, if we're going to have the conversation, that's fine. I'm just saying that's not part of right now. So I would just say anything ag ed, I would just not include in this purple right now, leave as that, but then your R1 and within that, those areas, yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So we have a clarifying question in the chat. So Jennifer Moore is asking, do these color areas change the zoning from what it is now? No, they don't change the zoning. It's just the areas where this particular type of PUD would be allowed to be. So there's still the underlying zoning. This is just another layer looking at the type of PUD that could go in these spots.
I would just add to it, Jessica, that where the Planning Commission decides to set the threshold for when you have to be a PUD, then one of the choices from these maps would have to be selected. So let's say you drew the line at 4 acres or 10 acres or 20 acres, and you said everything above that needed to be a PUD, then it would have to be one of the choices available for that property. It relates back to the underlying zoning in terms of uses, but the PUD type itself would apply, and that's, you know, you haven't finalized your thresholds, but that's the direction that you gave us previously.
Okay, yeah, thank you. This might be a good time if anyone else in the public has any questions about what we've been talking about. It's a little complicated. You could turn on your video and wave or unmute if you're on phone, or continue to use the chat. So. Okay, I'm not hearing anything right now. Any other commissioner comments or questions on this piece?
It's not relevant, but we should remember that UVM is a land grant college, and they probably got this land donated or granted for free. So I don't have a lot of sympathy with their economic interest in it. I don't think they will build dormitories there because that doesn't give them the return they want if we didn't change it, but it's just something to bear in mind.
So Paul, are we moving on to the minor amendment for the NRP area? Was that what was?
Sure, I can be pretty quick because I know we're getting to close to 9. I mostly just wanted to highlight a couple of things that staff had been thinking about as to how to complement your other work. So the NRP things that we were thinking about were, one, generally in the Southeast Quadrant, how to relate this to your PUD work. And I think I'd mentioned this before, that we're looking at if somebody is in a development area, that they would not be required to buy TDRs if they don't want to. If they choose to just stick with what they've got, then they could build at just 1.2 units an acre. But our proposal is that they would have to select an area where they're building more compactly than that, where they're meeting the minimums of the TND. Then they would be a leftover amount of land that they could either reserve for the future or that they could choose to permanently conserve. So that's sort of what we're thinking about as to how this would work with TDRs in the Southeast Quadrant. And then similarly to the rest of the Southeast Quadrant, if you need to bring in TDRs, then you can buy them and bring them in for up up to whatever the cap of that PUD type is. The other piece of it that we're recommending is some tweaks to the NRP standards. We've had some experience now with these in the last 15 years, and I think we've found that they're pretty good, but there's a little bit of a hole in them in that they don't really specify if you're allowed to build one house on, say, you've got 10 acres and you're allowed to build one house. It doesn't really say how encompassing the area of that house can be. It says there needs to be a conservation plan, but it doesn't really give the DRB much more guidance than that. And so we'd like to propose that that the LDRs include a maximum building envelope wherein all the things associated with your house that are development oriented would need to be. So if you decided to build a tennis court, or you decided to build a garage and things like that, that they need to be in a contained area so that it's not sort of extending over a wide area of what's supposed to be a conservation district. And we have the language written for that one, and we're happy to share it whenever you'd like. But there's been a lot of talk about conservation, and this is a piece of the puzzle that we wanted to kind of flag for you.
That is the proposal at the bottom of page 2, and it looks reasonable to me.
Yes, Michael, that's the one at the bottom of page 2. And I've got the language, and I'm happy to share it whenever you've got time on your agenda.
And then Paul, were you also going to be circling back on the TDR change for last week's meeting on the Shearer?
Yep, we are angling ourselves. I worked on it a bunch today. We are positioning ourselves so that you will have full draft language and an initial legal review for your next regular meeting 2 weeks from now, so that if you're ready, you can warn a public hearing on it.
Do we have another meeting next week? This is a special meeting. Don't we meet again next week?
No, this is a fifth Tuesday month, so this is
okay.
Your next regular meeting is 2 weeks from tonight.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Paul, I had a couple of comments under the bullet points, TND PUDs under all designated buildable area must have a minimum of 4 units. I thought we'd agreed that if it's a conservation PUD, there would be an option for a landowner to build less than that minimum of 4.
Right. So that would be if it's a conservation PUD, then yes, we haven't worked out that language, but yes, that's what you had discussed. My bullet point was if somebody is a traditional neighborhood, then they need to meet the minimums of being a traditional neighborhood.
Okay, and the bullet point above it, I made a note for myself, should exclude hazards and level 1 resources for the calculation of density in that type of PUD. Other than that, I have nothing to say on this.
Well, and Paul, this is where I'm getting confused, because weren't we talking about making TND PUDs building type? And if so, why would there be any conversation of any density?
Because you still have a TDR program in the Southeast Quadrant. So we need to sort of, unless the proposal is to eliminate it, we need to sort of meld these things together. And that's what this is trying to do. So there's still a minimum density in the TNDs no matter where you are. There's a 4 units per acre minimum. It's the maximum that's not set. And so the 1.2 here is to sort of deal with the fact that there's an existing TDR program, and then allowing people to build up from it. It's been a little bit of a head scratcher, but I think we can get there.
All right, because I thought we were going to be instead use TDRs instead of density to have flexibility with housing type, or to shift up one in housing types. This is going back to the density, so then that confuses me, because yeah.
Well, Monica, the use of TDRs would be flexible, not just for dwelling units. It could be, we could characterize it, a TDR could be used for all kinds of applications, not just housing density, or could be used for housing bulk, could be used for lot coverage. So I'm hoping there'll be some flexibility there, if that's what you're concerned about.
No, that I'm looking at it like we need all those things, because I was expecting any conversation of density to not be in here. And so I'm actually glad you pointed this part of the memo back out. When I was reading this, I was confused about why we were talking about density, even in the SEQ, if we're going towards building type, which I thought made a lot of sense.
Well, I guess that, and maybe this is something for you to all chew on, but my assumption at the staff level was that given that there is currently a maximum of 1.2 dwelling units per acre without the, and then you can on top of that buy TDRs, that you didn't want to just open that up automatically in a PUD and not make anybody have to buy TDRs in order to build in the southeast quadrant beyond 1.2 units an acre. So that's what we were trying to sort of meld together here. Because if you remove that, then you do have the benefit of creating neighborhood, but then you lose the part of people purchasing TDRs to do it.
Yeah.
And then you would need to, I guess, find more areas elsewhere in the city to meet that end of the TDR contract to find receiving areas for the conserved the NRP areas.
Is anybody else confused about the buildable piece than me? Because I really liked how clean that build type was and the flexibility that it gave. And I understand it is potentially minimizing or changing how TDRs, but TDRs have, the marketplace hasn't been selling well anyway. So I thought we were looking for alternate ways for alternate uses of TDRs. And so, for example, if we were requiring the 30% one family, 30% two family, 30% three family, whatever, that if you purchase X TDRs, you can shift that to all two family and three families, or, you know, which is kind of buying density, but it's not discussed as density. It's discussed as shift of housing type to make it easy. So
I will get some confusion on that as well. Not sure on that.
But you'd use TDRs to buy density over and above the underlying density of that zone.
Would it be helpful if I did a little side by side for you? This has taken staff a little time to wrap our heads around this subject also, because it's different from everywhere else in the city because of the TDR program. But we can help you if you want, do a little side by side to understand how it could be the same or could be different and what the consequences of that would be.
I guess, Paul, I would echo what Monica said. I thought with the building type, the density thing was kind of a bit. I didn't. I'm not sure how the TDR fits in there now. I guess it would be good to see that.
Okay.
Paul, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. I don't want to answer the wrong way.
So the question is, the PUDs make it such that a landowner has to build at least 4 units per acre, as opposed to a land being able to build just 1 or 2 additional homes. If they do not want to conserve immediately, then any additional building would require a future PUD. Doesn't that make landowners have to develop? So there's a couple of different options that a landowner would have. One is that there's going to be a threshold below which you may not have to be a PUD. So if somebody's just carving out 1 lot, it probably wouldn't trigger a PUD. After that, then this is what Michael was just referring to as there may be some parts of the city where allowing for a couple of large lot homes, if somebody was going to conserve a significant amount of the land, could be done. But yes, beyond that, one of the objectives, as I understand it, of the PUD project is to have properties planned out, so that if somebody is going to be creating 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 homes on a property, that they're thinking about the entire property as they do it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. Any other questions or comments on this? It sounds like we're gonna have to come back to the TDR piece.
Okay.
Well, and the density, the building, or what do we call it? Building versus a lot land-based density, building-based or land-based density calculations. We need to come back to that, Paul, I think.
Okay.
A lot of us are still confused. I am.
Right, so at our last meeting, there were some questions about the 500-year floodplain. It's also called the 0.2% floodplain. We have been in contact with the state floodplain managers for our area. I don't know if Paul, you want to get into it, or you know, what they said was that, you know, there aren't really communities. They didn't know of any towns that did a full regulatory protection on the 500-year floodplain in Vermont. But there are some real reasons why we would probably want to, and they actually cited one of the studies that I co-authored that basically showed that with climate change and the change we're seeing towards larger storms, that we are seeing more flooding that happens, and that in a lot of cases, the future 100-year storm really is closer to the current 500-year storm. So, you know, there is potentially a compelling reason to regulate the 500-year floodplain at a higher level, knowing that, you know, that's kind of the future 100-year. So I think that there's definitely a resiliency reason to limit development in the 500-year, just based on those scientific trends towards larger storms and projections. So looks like Paul has a map up here for us.
Yep, so this is the map showing the pink is the hazards that you are regulating or propose to regulate, and the blue represents the 500-year floodplain. So there are some areas along Potash Brook next to Dorset Street that this would apply. The biggest single area that would apply is the Ethan Allen Industrial Park. And so if you decided to move in the direction of regulating the 500-year floodplain, then that would probably move us. We've been pretty fortunate with the 100-year floodplain that we have virtually no existing development in it. And so our regulations basically say you can't build in the 100-year floodplain. If you decided to go to the 500-year, we'd be entering into doing some regulations a little bit like most Vermont towns, which is what do you do with new development, and then what do you do with existing development? So, for example, the Ethan Allen Park, you'd have to come up with what happens with proposals within that area, which is not, it's not insurmountable. It's just a different area that we haven't really had to address, whereas most Vermont towns have had to address this for many, many years. So,
yeah.
And Paul, that would still be buildable, but the buildings themselves might need to meet certain flood friendly regulation, right?
That's right. So we've taken, in our 100-year floodplain, we've been pretty aggressive and basically have just said no development, period. Whereas most communities, take Montpelier, which is mostly in a floodplain, they have flood resiliency standards within their floodplain, because if they said no development, then they just wouldn't see anything ever happen in their downtown again. So this would, in some areas of the city at least, begin to enter into this flood resiliency recommendations.
Right. And, I think there are ways to limit new development and to have expansions be, like you're saying, like more resilient. So, I mean, there is draft language available. At this point, most Vermont towns have it targeted towards their 100-year floodplain. I think if you're interested, we could do it, and there are definitely resiliency reasons why we might want to. So
Yeah, and maybe an approach would be, we already have no building in the 100. We could say no, maybe say like no new construction in the 500, and then where you're replacing or whatever, have some kind of flood resiliency construction.
Yeah, no new building in the 500 would be a good start. I don't know, Jessica, in other municipalities, have they faced, if there are grandfathered or existing buildings in a 100-year floodplain, are they given some sort of exemption?
yeah, there are like certain amount of change you can do with regard to like footprint. So there are some things that you can do, to upgrade, maintain your property. Usually it has like guidance about like where on the property. So if you're going to expand, maybe expand to the side or the front instead of towards the back, towards the floodplain. Like there's often like guidance like that included.
Jessica, also, can you help me understand? So in the 500, the no building versus resiliency building, if in the 500, like the 200 to 500, if something is built and there is a flood, is the no build there to say we don't want the buildings to then be harmed, or is there an environmental reason you don't want the buildings there?
In the case
to protect life and property.
Yeah, it's more of a safety reason, is the reason the floodplain is put into regulation for the most part, to keep people and property out of harm's way. But by building in it, it also can potentially push floodwaters onto someone else's property as well. So, the more development you put in those floodplains, the more it can exacerbate the problem by kind of moving where the flooding happens.
Well, so, here's what, in regard to that, and then everything else that we've talked about, I do think that in every lot that we are making a change, a proposed change to Article 12, I really would love to see the city issue a letter to those landowners and make sure, other than just a newspaper ad or something saying we're going to have this public hearing, I really do feel like every South Burlington landowner who has an Article 12 change pending their property should receive also a direct communication from the city pointing out in the best it can how the changes would impact them specifically, or where to find out, and then to make sure they know about our public hearing that comes in, because we can look at this and say that's not significant and it doesn't look significant to me, but it does seem like it would be good to make sure that every landowner does have a direct communication on because of this Article 12 is pretty significant overall.
I would strongly agree with that, Monica. How many businesses are over in that park over there? 30, 40? At least. That's a big chunk of businesses over there. To just suddenly drop something like this on them, I think would be a hornet's nest. I'm not saying it's not not necessarily right to do, but there needs to be definitely some dialogue with those folks over there.
Yeah, and maybe we don't have the bandwidth to take on this now. I don't know. It was brought up at our last meeting. I think there's, it's a valid discussion.
And I think in resiliency measures immediately is that I would just do that, period. But the question about the no new build is just something I would, maybe there wouldn't be feedback on it. Maybe it would be fine. I don't know.
Oh yeah, a few years ago when we strengthened our floodplain regulations to what they are now, we got very, very, very little comment or discussion. But I think that that's partially because of what Paul said. There's very little existing development within those areas. So, and people already knew those areas were in a floodplain, like the zone didn't change. We just changed kind of what happened within the zone. So this would be a larger change than that time period. So.
It seems worth doing it now because we're doing all these other changes. I just think the direct communication would be helpful.
I do. Those business owners know they're in a floodplain there.
I will leave it with that. Oh, okay. I guess that's all.
I don't know if we have a lot of consensus as to where to go with this, and it is a whole nother kind of piece. I guess, do people think it's worth pursuing at this time? Maybe nodding and thumbs up if you think we should continue to look at this now.
You mean go to 500?
I think we should continue to look at it, and I agree that we should let people know about the change so that they can weigh in for the potential change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
yeah, and I would lean towards a more lenient resiliency planning, unless there's areas that are very important and suggest no build. But for anything, I wouldn't limit new build, but I would put in the resiliency across the board. I don't know how others feel about that.
I would
I think you have
agree.
to do it anyway in a floodplain.
yeah,
I think to be proactive, if there's areas that have not been built on, that we shouldn't allow building on them. If there are areas that are already built on, then I think, resiliency design, if they're gonna, modify the structure or put a new structure in the area that they should be required to meet a higher flood design standard. But if a lot of these are just a little bit of wedges and stuff, and so if there's not building on those, I wouldn't, because Jessica's right. I mean, her original point that that the 500-year flood may become the 100-year flood. I think this is our opportunity to be proactive in not allowing buildings that are going to be damaged in some future flood. Now, if something's already there, you can't really change that, but you can require that, if they modify the building or if they build a new structure in the existing area, that they build it to a higher standard. And there's a whole bunch of, flood hazard mitigation design things that you can do in terms of, elevating buildings and not having basement windows and, having, water resistant doors. And, there's a whole bunch of things that can be done to existing buildings to mitigate damage.
Just taking a very quick look around the city, I would guess that there's probably 30 to 50 homes that would be in this, largely in the Butler Farms neighborhood, a little bit in Chamberlain, and a little bit in Country Club Estates. And then the most significant commercial area is the Ethan Allen Industrial Park, and there's a couple of others. The rest of the areas are either greenfield or sort of, up along the railway or something like that.
And Paul, all of those, the houses that you just discussed in the neighborhoods, those are already in what's identified as a floodplain, right? It's not new, or is that new?
No, I'm saying that, let's say the Butler Farms neighborhood, there's, maybe a dozen homes or so that are within the 500-year floodplain. The home is already there.
So
And
it wouldn't change that in any way. Like we would just say like they wouldn't have a new home built in their backyard.
well, but currently in the 100-year floodplain is what I'm asking. Those homes, those 5 homes?
Oh. I'm not sure that our mapping is good enough to say that. I would say that for the most part, we have not historically allowed development in the 100-year floodplain. Whether the mapping changed over time to make it so that a home got in there, but I would say generally speaking, homes are not in the 100-year floodplain unless they're really, really, really old in South Burlington.
So I would just to property values of existing homes if they're already moving into 500. I don't know what that means to the homeowner, but I would just be mindful of that.
Those details we can talk about. We wouldn't be changing their zone. We would be changing what new things could get built in that zone. Like they're already in it. So like it already comes up on a property search, like FEMA already designates those areas in that way. We're not changing any kind of line. We're just saying like within that area that exists, we no longer want a new thing built there. And then we can look at what those details are and what makes sense and get feedback.
Right. We might say though, if there's an existing structure and they're gonna modify it more than a certain percent, that they have to, have some flood resiliency features in there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so to use Butler Farms as an example, there's nothing in there that's in the 100-year floodplain. There are stream setbacks per your regulations, but there is a portion of the 500-year floodplain that extends into that neighborhood.
Okay. Anything else on this or any public comment on any of these items? Because I think we're getting late, so I think we'll want to move into the next item, which is consider approach to review of LDR amendments under consideration. So Paul, you brought this up a little bit at the last meeting. Did you?
Sure, I'll try to be really quick. There's sort of three to four total buckets of amendments that we have made progress on. One are things related to the PUDs, which we understand are top priority. One are some outstanding elements of the form-based code committee work from last year. One are some bigger projects that have been working their way along, like the traffic overlay district, that we will, have some updates for you in a couple months. And then there's a fourth category of stuff that we've collected over the last 6 months that, either DRB feedback or others that we're basically ready to share them with you and get your feedback. For the most part, they're not controversial, but they do require review. So we were sort of curious. We were going to recommend that, maybe sometime in the winter, the form-based code committee meet again. You'd have to appoint a new member to take Art's spot, but to do that, a form-based code subcommittee. And then maybe for the other ones, do you want to see it as a whole commission? Do you want to not see them at all right now? Or do you want to have a subgroup, sort of like you did with the Shearer thing, where staff might be able to knock out a bunch of small changes that we've essentially already written and get your thumbs up or thumbs down on them, and then bring to the full commission? I guess that's what we wanted to get your feedback on.
And I would just remind that you're also going to have, with the interim zoning, TDR and likely TDR and affordable housing LDR revisions as well.
That's all part of PUD. I put all of that into PUD because they're all tied together. They really all need to work together.
You probably need to do both of those things, or possibly some would require a small group, subcommittee to work on, and others, staff brings it to the commission if we can knock them off quickly.
Okay. Do you want me to work with Jessica to sort of parse those out and see if we can get some simple ones straight to you and decide if there's some that we should seek volunteers for a small subgroup on?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, get a list of that.
Okay. Then under other business, we had the Chittenden Solid Waste Act 250 notice, as well as Paul forwarded the Burlington zoning change.
Yep, those are pretty small. The Burlington ones, they allow temporary tents to exist for a longer period of time, and I forget what the other one was, but they're both quite small.
Okay, anyone have anything else? Okay, thank you so much for this great long work session.
Oh, the other one allows daycares and preschools in more areas.
Oh, definitely okay by me. Tell them it's allowable.
All right, well,
All right,
thank
we
you,
adjourn.
everyone. Meeting adjourned. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time as always.
Hey, Jess?